Yeah, good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome to the Footprint Evaluation and Climate Crisis in Africa session as part of the Africa Evaluation INDABA. I'm hoping that everyone has been enjoying the discussions that will be going on. So today we should focus to footprint evaluation and climate change. We have esteemed panelists that will be leading the conversations, and then I'll pass on to the moderator. Taku, over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning to esteemed clear friends. My name is Taku. As Sia has just said, I'm pleased to welcome you once again to this session on footprint evaluation and the climate crisis in Africa. What does this mean for evaluation in and for Africa? I guess if you joined on Tuesday, the Vice Chancellor of Wits University, Prof. Zebulon, already set a tone around the climate crisis, the pandemic that we do not know when it would actually end. So it reminds me of the words of the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kim Moon, when he said climate change has happened because of human behavior. Therefore, human beings should address this issue. It may not be too late if we take decisive actions today. And I'm also reminded of a tweet that Ian Goldman posted a few days ago when he said, we only have one Earth, we better try to save it. Like Sia had said, we have got 4 fabulous panelists who are experts in their own way. I'll give them a chance to answer some of the questions that would frame the conversation today on climate crisis in Africa. Who do we have as the panelists today? We do have Dr. Juha. Juha is a director of Global Evaluation Facility, Independent Evaluation Office. And the Global Environmental Facility is a financial mechanism to 5 multilateral environmental agreements, including the conventions on biodiversity, climate change, desertification, and environmentally harmful chemicals. Since 1999, he has worked in senior positions within the Global Environment Facility and the United Nations Development Program. He has conducted and managed numerous evaluations at the global, regional, and country level, focusing on environmental factors. Thank you very much for contributing to this session. Let me introduce Weronika. Weronika is the Vice President of the International Evaluation Academy, 2-term Secretary General in IOCE, member of Executive Committee of Eval Partners, and past a board member of European Evaluation Society, former Polish Evaluation Society President, Footprint Evaluation Thought Partner. She is a researcher at Latvian University, focusing on adaptability and resilience of women in Latvia. She cooperated with all major evaluation companies in Poland as a freelancer and academic since 2008. Thank you, Weronika, and welcome to this session. Let me introduce Mine. Mine is the managing partner of Athari Advisory based in Kenya. Mine has worked in the evaluation space for over 20 years and is currently supporting a number of different organizations such as MasterCard Foundation, WWF, IDRC. She's a co-editor on the book on evidence use in Africa together with Prof. Ian Goldman, and has supported Twentempele with the training programs on knowledge management and rapid evaluation. Prior to Athari, Mine worked with the International Union of Conservation of Nature as a deputy director, programs in Eastern and Southern Africa. Thank you so much, Mine, for your contribution in this session. Lastly, Adjunct Professor Dugan Fraser is the program manager at the Global Evaluation Initiative in the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group. He has worked previously as the director of the Center for Learning on Evaluation and Results at the University of Witwatersrand. Before that, he was the program director at Wraith Foundation, where he was responsible for program strategy, design and implementation, monitoring and evaluation, and the provision of technical advice to grantees. He has worked before as an independent public and development management consultant, specializing in monitoring and evaluation for learning accountability and performance improvement. He was previously the chairperson of the board of the South African Monitoring and Evaluation Association. Thank you, Dugan, and you are welcome. So without wasting much of the time, let's just get into the conversation today. I would start with Mine. Mine, how can Africa's distinct contextual realities inhabit or advance the mainstreaming of footprint evaluation? What are the implications for Africa? Over to you, Mine.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. It's such a pleasure to be here. I have a couple of slides to start off the discussion. Let me just try and load them. Can you see my slides? Am I sharing the right screen?
Yes, Minette.
All right, thank you. So to start us off, I think Africa has an incredibly difficult position today. We're in a bit of a dilemma. We hear it repeatedly. Africa is responsible for generating less than 3% of all of the greenhouse gas emissions, yet is suffering amongst some of the most significant consequences of climate change and receiving only 5.5% of the total climate financing. On the other hand, the reality is that development and growth in Africa is critical for us. We need to grow our industries to create meaningful jobs for our youthful population. We need to ensure access to energy, health, and other critical services, and we really need to do so soon. We've been on the back foot for far too long. I hear it quite often. In fact, just the other day, I was in a workshop where somebody said, what do you expect Africa to do? Do you expect it to leave its fossil fuels in the ground while everybody else has grown wealthy off theirs? We need to use our fossil fuels. There's no other way we can develop otherwise. And I think that's the big question for us today. Today, the bulk of the emissions that we do emit are as a result of land use change and forestry, with the agricultural sector being the largest emissions contributor. So we're losing our forests to regain and to gain new agricultural land. And the question to me is really, is this the trajectory we want to take? Do we want to follow the economically strong countries off the cliff? And the wildebeest that you see at the bottom picture are really a lot wiser than that. And surely we can put our abilities that we've demonstrated over the decades to be resilient and to be innovative, surely we can put them to better use. And the question of this panel is, does evaluation have a role to play in navigating a different pathway for Africa's growth and development? Personally, I don't think it's an either or. I don't think we're either going to end up with the tarmac road in the forest or the Murram road in the tropical the tarmac road in the desert or the Murram road in the tropical forest. I think surely humanity has demonstrated that we have a lot more imagination than one or the other choices. And I don't think there's any doubt for me personally that as evaluators, we do have a role to play in visioning and realizing a new way of growing and developing. I actually think we have a responsibility to play this role. But to do so, I think there's quite a few boxes that we need to break out of, and boxes that we found ourselves and almost solidified ourselves in over the decades. I'll just mention a couple of them. I think the most obvious of these boxes, and this comes up in a number of different conversations, is the program and project box. The one that limits our focus and scope to sort of the linear cause effect of relationships. And breaking out of this box is really one of the main ways of doing this, is just getting better at using systems approaches. It's about integrating connectivity and complexity. It's about really integrating the relationship between the projects, the programs that we're evaluating, and the wider challenges that society is facing, irrespective of the project that we're evaluating. It's also about being able to get better at being better at taking a foresight approach, really thinking forward into the future. The diagram on the left-hand side, as you can see from the diagram on the left-hand side, 5 out of the 10 global risks are environmentally related. And 5 to 10 years down the road is not so far into the future, especially when you're my age. So I'm not sure that integrating foresight or footprint into our evaluations, integrating considerations of the environment into our evaluations is really any longer a nice to do. I think it's really a need to do, and we need to figure out how to unlock the barriers that prevent us from doing so. Another one of the boxes is this predominant belief that we can understand the world simply by really unpicking and understanding in great depth the individual pieces of the world or of a program or of a system. And with this comes the belief that we are rational human beings, whose behaviors can be influenced by facts from an expert. As Harari pointed out in his book on 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, it is a mistake, however, to put so much trust in the rational individual. As Africans, I think we know better. We come from a long history of community, debate, and dialogue, and being able to draw on the diversity of wisdom within our communities. I would argue that it's not only time that we rediscovered confidence in our own ways of understanding the world and making decisions, but I think it's also time that we started to show the rest of the world new ways of doing so. And I'll just end by highlighting a couple of things that are already taking place, and I think some really exciting movements. Samir, for example, has established a community of practice on evaluation for just transition, which has developed and is piloting 2 new evaluation criteria on climate and ecosystem health, as well as transformative equity. I think we can learn from these experiences, and we can start to draw on them on many other countries in Africa. So thank you, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mina, for the opening. In light of what Mina has just said, Dugan, what is your take on the posed question?
So, I mean, I agree very, very wholeheartedly with where Mina is coming from, and I've got a question that I'm going to be responding to that I'm going to keep my best answers for. But I think the main thing really is for evaluation to start seeing itself as a change agent and to really pick a side. And I'm going to talk more about that when I get an opportunity. I think that the time to position evaluation as a sort of neutral, objective, independent view has passed, and that in many ways, the job of evaluation is to be much more explicit about in whose interests it seeks to speak. And that it needs to be done fully cognizant of all of the contradictions inherent in people who look like me, speaking on behalf of people who are poor or who are Black or who are marginalized in different ways. But I think that as the crisis intensifies and as we come to understand the fact that the COVID pandemic was an environmental crisis, it is a consequence of human infringement on natural habitats. And we come to understand the interconnectedness of all of these issues. We need to get much better at being able to engage around uncertainty and complexity and emergence, and really be far more willing to take a stance and speak on behalf of the people we're supposed to be defending or protecting, or whose interests we seek to advance. So I'll leave it at that, because I'm gonna talk more on these issues when I get a gap. But Mina, as ever, I fully agree with everything that she said.
Thank you very much, Dugan. And Juha, what's your take on the first presentation by Mina?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that it really set the scene perfectly. I mean, it highlighted all of the big issues and big connections that we have there. And I was just reflecting on the fact that Mina put forward the top 10 risks to humanity, and mentioned that five of them are environmental directly, but one could argue also that several others are environment related, including, just like Dugan was saying, that the COVID crisis has its root causes in environment. But it's also worth noting that those 10 risks were not identified by Greenpeace or by the World Wildlife Fund. They were from the World Economic Forum, the Davos crowd, which is a group of hard-nosed business leaders, basically, and political leaders. So this is real stuff that we have to really pay attention to. The other related thing that I think is this whole issue of policy coherence, and that Mina was alluding to without using the words, but you know, how do we combine our environmental and concerns into the economic policy and social policy and so forth. I just put forth one more figure, which is the fact that it has been calculated that all public and private funding together for environmental work, climate work, amounts to something about $648 billion a year. Sounds like a lot. Then IMF earlier this year, I think, or late last year, published a report where they had calculated how much governments put only into subsidizing fossil fuels, and compare that to the $648 billion, that figure is $5.9 trillion. So there are indeed some choices that we have to make here. How do we combine and integrate and find the right balance between promoting economic development and needed social change and whatever, without destroying the planet in the process. And a lot of it could be done by just, you know, by having better economic policies as well. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Juha, for that. Yes, policy coherence is an important thing to integrate in our social, political, and economic discourse. And Weronika, what's your take on what the colleagues have already alluded to?
Thanks a lot, Taco. I think two takeaways from me for now from the first question is, Mina said that African continent cannot be expected not to build their development on the fossil fuels, while other countries have benefited from that. And I see two dilemmas here. I don't think it's a false logic, but I do see two dilemmas here. First, I think what's going on in the African continent is still not using the fossil fuels of African continent for the development of the African continent. It's very much sucked out for development of the global north. And the other thing is also that we have a very ill growth paradigm of development. And what we need to say, we need to do what Dugan rightly said, is that we really need to help to reconstruct the paradigm of development, of how we flourishing as societies, how we move on. I mean, nothing in this world, in the environmental sense, grows without any limits. It's against thermodynamic laws. Everything can mature and find its new purpose. And we need to do it as societies, as the world. And I think the second thing what Dugan said is that we really need to rethink why we're doing evaluation, what's the purpose of evaluation. And when I just have this pleasure and privilege to speak on African evaluation event, I very much think that what we need is the healing stories, stories that can reconstruct our thinking, that can really decolonize our minds. And that's what has been historically done in many different societies by healers, by people who have been critical eye of the society, but they've never been part of that society. And I think very much evaluators often like to be with auditors, with administrators, with people who just, you know, they are there to clap their backs and just be part of the community that speaks about strengthening capacity development and this sort of things that we love to use the same jargon and be on the same page. Whereas if we want to be really evaluators, that means we bringing a fresh look at the things to the society. And I really agree with Dugan. We need to have a new role to play.
Thank you very much, Weronika, for that. I think you are on point that evaluation should see itself as a change agent, but without wasting much time, let's get into the other question. In light of all that has been said, what have been the key successes, challenges in advancing footprint evaluation? What have we accomplished? What has worked? What has not worked? Over to you, Juha.
Thanks very much. That's a big question, and I'll try to be somehow organized here. I think what has been a very positive development is obviously the fact that we have much more discussion on these issues, and you have the international attention. We had the COP27 just finishing, and there are the sustainable development goals that rest ostensibly on the pillars of people, planet, and prosperity, saying that you do need all the three, and so on, for sustainable development. But in practice, of course, the emphasis still is very much on the traditional notion of economic growth, and I think that's a basic challenge. But there is an increasing recognition about this, that we do need to take the environment more into account and go beyond also just do no harm. It's slightly different initiative than what is officially called the footprint evaluation, but we have a parallel initiative doing similar things with the United Nations Evaluation Group, and I'm actually coordinating that effort. And we have been looking into how the UN evaluation units incorporate social and environmental concerns into their evaluations. And I should say that there are currently 53 evaluation units that participate from the UN in this effort. So talk about coherence there already. And of course, they all have their own interests and own mandates and perspectives and so on. But we did do a survey of them, and we had 39 of those units participating, and we were looking at their evaluations and evaluation policies and practices and so on. It's a very mixed picture that arises. So the good news, thinking of whether the glass is half full or half empty, is that 45% of the units surveyed said that they have significant stake in environmental matters. So that may sound pretty good. On the other hand, 45% is less than half of the agencies who thought that they had any stake in environment, which on the one hand is a little bit worrying, because you can say that basically everything that you do has an environmental impact. So there's still some awareness raising to be done. On the other hand, 84% of the agencies evaluators thought that not enough is being done on environmental issues, which is a good thing. It's a good opportunity for us to work on these things. So, right, so how do we go about it? I think one of the things is really that we have to think about that, like I said, everything has an environmental impact. Everything should rest both in environmental, social, and economic pillars. And as has been said, that all interventions, whether they are policies, programs, or projects or whatever, they all take place in a larger context. So there is the policy context, there is the national context, there is the context whether there is a conflict or poverty or so. There are then all other interventions that are there. So you can't anymore go and evaluate an intervention in isolation. I don't think that you can anymore use the good old linear logic model and say that, okay, let's see whether this intervention did what it set out to do, and whether it dealt with the risks and so on, and whether the outputs led to outcomes and voila, impact. Because very seldom is there actually impact, and unfortunately often in environmental programs and so on. So the impact, the projects are successful, but the impact never spreads beyond them. So the context is very important. The other important thing for us, I think, is that we have to integrate both the natural and human systems into our evaluations. And that's not easy either, because there are challenges, and the evaluators tend to be social scientists who have less knowledge and competence on the natural side of things, and you have issues of scale, and you have issues of time and so on that we have to deal with. One thing is, of course, that the projects are 4, 5, 6 years, and environmental processes may take much longer. For example, in the GEF, we did an evaluation of our portfolio of land degradation projects. And the projects are really usually 5 or 6 years long, but we found when we did ex-post evaluation that the actual environmental impacts, positive impacts of these projects started emerging about 5 years after the project had closed. So we're talking about 10 to 12 years before you can see the environmental impacts. You have to think in those terms, and also it's a hard sell for many donors, for example, to think in such a long term. And I'm talking too long, I think, but still one issue where we are looking at this, when we do environmental evaluation, we have to look at the root causes, because as it was started by Taku here, that all of the root causes and the drivers of environmental change are basically in what humans are doing. So we have to look at those, and we have to look at the teleconnections. Weronika was referring to the fact that the African energy resources are benefiting the North more than Africa, but the same goes for, deforestation happens locally, but it's often driven by global forces. So if you don't look at that scale and the teleconnections between what happens locally and globally, so you're missing the point, and the evaluators have to learn how to do that also. So those are the kind of principles that we are trying to apply in the GEF now, and we are doing it in several ways, but really getting into this integrated perspectives, looking at the root causes and teleconnections is important. The context, poverty linkages to environment, for example, are very important. And we looked at a set of countries in the Sudan Sahel belt where GEF has been working for decades now, and we found that the projects and programs that are doing best are the ones that link natural resources management with poverty and livelihoods. And so, for example, climate change adaptation projects were having better results than purely going for mitigation, when actually, indeed, so Africa hasn't contributed much to it. Okay, if I have one more point, is that we also try to use multiple sources of information for our evaluations. So we use, of course, the traditional evaluation methods and collecting data in the field through whatever you do, but also we've been using satellite data, which can create credible time series, quantifiable data on what has actually happened on the ground. We have used other organizations' survey data. For example, the World Bank does quite solid household surveys, which we have then taken, instead of doing them ourselves, and combine them with our own data collection and methods. So that's one way, is also that we have to think big and cooperate and work across organizations to do evaluation. That was longer than my brief was supposed to be, but well, there's so many things to say. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Some of the things we elaborate when people post their questions. But in light of what Juha has just said, Weronika, what do you think are some of the key successes and challenges in advancing footprint evaluation, just in a minute?
Okay. I will speak about successes a bit later, referring to my questions. I will answer as Dugan in a very political way. Just let me answer my main question. But about challenges, I think the challenge is the whole system of development in which we live. I mean, I was thinking about decolonization of evaluation, and also, referring to some of the Jason Hicka work about colonization, that is still maybe less visible, but we're still very much living it. And there's just on everyday basis, even in my part of the world, in Central Eastern Europe, there's so much of a pressure to normalize privileges we have and not to go against the mainstream, not to descale what you have, descale how you live humbler, because that's not perceived as a successful living. That I think the main challenge is in general that what also Jean Pretorius has posed as a question, that reconstruction of development is the biggest point, because what I always say, it's about ontological part of every evaluation, right? Of the world, how we see it. And we still, I think we are not very much a mainstream of how it's being perceived by evaluators, and that's the biggest challenge.
Thank you very much, Weronika. So, Dugan, this is to you. What is the role of evaluation in contributing to the shift in systems that perpetuate inequality and social injustices globally? Why is it important that we address the issue of inclusion, of environmental sustainability in all evaluations? Over to you, Dugan.
Thanks, Taku, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I really appreciate it. Also, just was busy typing a message in the chat box, and I will finish it, but I want to remind people that there are a lot of resources on the footprint page on better evaluation, A, and then B, on the National Evaluation Capacities Conference website, the NEC website. If you go to 2022 NEC and you go to the workshop tab and you look for workshop 9, which was the footprint workshop, there's a very comprehensive presentation there, which you can access a lot of resources on as well. And so I want to be quite quick, but you know, we come from a tradition in which evaluators have historically said the intervention was successful, PS, the river was poisoned and the community died. Do you know what I mean? And I think we have to really take responsibility for that tradition. And we also need to acknowledge that we are, as a consequence of the crises in which we operate, a very deep dystopian expectation. Like, we are really in a space where people expect the future to be terrible. And the right-wing movements that are being so successful all over Europe and elsewhere are really capitalizing on people's pessimistic outlooks. They really are successfully speaking about the past in a way that makes people nostalgic and yearn for something different. And we have to switch that narrative. We have to make people imagine a future that's going to be better than our past. We have to help people reimagine how our lives will be. We have to overcome the sense of inevitable horror, that in fact the future is going to be one of nightmarish floods and heat and migration and overcrowding and pain. We have to get into a space where we're able to convey a story where we overcome our contemporary challenges. And so there is a responsibility for evaluators to be relentlessly optimistic and to help people imagine a better world and to call out the parties that are preventing us from getting to that place. We can't just say, oh, yeah, the intervention was great and it's a pity the river was poisoned and the people died. The intervention was not great. The intervention was terrible. The intervention killed the people. And finding the voice to say those things is the challenge that evaluation has to face. And that means that we have to be very explicit about on whose behalf we speak. We are not the cool, neutral voice of scientific rationalism. We're in place to help people know whether the resources that are being spent to improve the lives of poor people are being properly used. If those resources lead to their being poisoned, we need to call out the intervention. And it's actually not a big dilemma. It's pretty straight up. It's a clear choice that we have to make. And in order for us to do that, we've got to function much more as a transdiscipline. We've got to get much better at interacting with the other elements of evaluation and foresight that are going to be helpful to us. So strategic planners, monitors, people who work in research, people who are in other ways producing evidence that is helpful to allow us draw conclusions about merit, value, and worth, which is what evaluation is. Evaluation is intended to draw on evidence to support decision-making, and we have to start getting much better at collaborating in on how we make our determinations. And really, a critical piece of this puzzle is our capacity to be able to communicate uncertainty and ambiguity. We need to be able to say much more successfully when things are good and in what ways they're good, and when they're not good and the ways in which they are not good. We need to be much more successful at being able to say who is winning as a consequence of this intervention and who is losing, and to be far more successful at communicating that there are very, very diverse results achieved within the same intervention. It's not a case of saying that there's a single result. We have to be able to say, for these people, this thing is working, but for those people, this thing is not working. And that capacity to straddle contradiction, to be at peace with uncertainty and ambiguity and emergence are important, critical skills that we're going to have to build. And when we think about evaluation, we have to be so much better at being respectful and appreciative of other ways of knowing. So in the session I sat in on yesterday, which was about decolonization, there was mention made of indigenous knowledge systems and traditional ways of engaging and having conversations about results. We need to get better at all of those things, and we need to be more mindful and intentional about what constitutes evaluation. That's not to say we need to become a sort of cozy armchair chat amongst friends. We need to retain our scientific rigor. We need to be very, very scrupulous about what constitutes evidence, but we need to understand that it's not enough to use a narrow postbox view to understand whether or not an intervention has been successful. Our perspective needs to shift upstream and downstream. It needs to think not just about tomorrow, but the next 30 or 40 years. It needs to take account of not just what the people you have in front of you are saying and experiencing, but what the people behind them are saying and experiencing. And that's a lot. You know, that's a big ask. Those are really challenging things. But we can do this stuff. We have a lot of tools at our disposal. We have a lot of relationships that we can draw on. And most excitingly, we have technology that is going to enable us to do things differently. And those technology solutions are, like most things, double-sided. They can be used to invade people's privacy and commodify their data. But we can also operate in a way that is respectful and thoughtful and developmental and empowering. So this is the challenge that evaluation faces, and it's an exciting moment in the development of the discipline. And I think that we are well placed to respond to it, but we have to have courage and we have to be clear on how we want to be differently. So I'll stop there, otherwise I can just go on and on.
Thank you very much, Dugan, for that deliberation. Yes, indeed, evaluations has to play a significant role in climate change and adaptability. So, Mina, in terms of what Dugan has just said, do you have anything to supplement to that before we move to the next question by Weronika?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts, and I'd like to pick up on this capacity to straddle contradictions. I mean, I think we are incredibly incapable sometimes of seeing contradictions. We're so very skilled at compartmentalizing that we often don't see the contradictions in doing that. And for example, I worked for decades for the environmental sector, and conservation and protection of environmental resources was something we did over there. We conserved in protected areas, but what we do over here is completely different. We build high-rise buildings, and that separation, I think, is fundamentally flawed and problematic. I ran workshops where we talked for hours about dynamiting coral reefs. And then we went for lunch and we ordered a big prawn dinner in an air-conditioned restaurant, not seeing the inherent contradictions of doing that. As evaluators, we come in the middle or we come in at the end, you know, we do our evaluation, neat and tidy package, and we walk away. But design has been flawed, and engaging with that then becomes incredibly difficult. And to me, these are some of the lines we need to figure out how to dissolve and how to blur so that we can indeed straddle contradictions a lot better than we do.
Indeed, thanks, Mina. So let's move on to the last question. Weronika, this is to you. Share lessons on how evaluations can embed consideration of environmental sustainability. Is there alignment between footprint evaluations and social justice? What is the value proposition for footprint evaluation in Africa? Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Taco. So yeah, maybe just a few slides very quickly and showing that I'm really much more on the side we're so fucked rather than the better world is possible, simply because that's what the evidence supports. So the hope never dies, and I think several of panelists here have very difficult role on everyday basis to try to give us hope that our work can be still ethical. But that's, for me, very often a big question. I'm trying to move on the slide. Yeah, I think just very quickly to show you why I think we're very, very fucked, right? Where historically we are reaching and how much we promised that we're going to decrease and descale the global north. And this is not happening. And if Juha is mentioning COP27, it again and again has not happened. If you remember around the COP26, we wrote in Evaluation Journal an article and over 10 evaluators have been commenting on what has happened on the COP26. And I think this time we just did not want to do something like this because we know it's just not even bringing any specific good result and new promises. And again, we have atmospheric colonization. If you're going to look at the global south, how much it's contributing and how much it suffers, right? There's much more suffering and cost on the side of the global south than global north. And obviously, majority of you know that. It's just to show visually where we are at this moment. And I think if you ask me, Taco, what are the successes of the footprint evaluation or my hopes that it changes the environment of evaluation and gives us simply an alternative or a value proposition that we can follow by developing very different new approaches. And I'm not saying this is the answer to all the problems. I'm just saying this is one of the freshly developed ones, right? Very rightly, Dugan has referred to all of the resources you can find online specifically about evaluation cases done by footprint evaluation, specifically about what has been developed as a checklist and other tools that you can apply. And I think I don't want to speak about this because me and Juha have been invited and Mina as thought leaders of the footprint evaluation. So we were not implementing that. But I think it's very important that this is exactly what we tried to understand, the humble position of evaluator, who, when you want to apply the nexus of human and environmental systems, you need to apply much more evidence beyond our discipline. You just, as Dugan and Juha said, it's impossible at this stage of evaluation to provide and produce evidence by our own. There's so much that we need to include from our disciplines and understand. You don't need to produce it, but you need to understand it, analyze it, and include that in your evaluations. And if we want to do ethical evaluation, again, it's very much about strengthening evaluative thinking. And it's very much evaluative thinking also by systems thinking, that what Juha was telling about local and global, right? We need to connect the dots much better as evaluators, and that's possible in any circumstances. So if Dugan is speaking about the right-wing politicians on the rise, it will be possible in any circumstances. And yes, we might have less of the tenders for evaluation. We might have less money flowing into evaluation. But if you want to be doing an ethical work at the end of the world as we know it, in any field you're having, in any profession you're having, you need to be standing on the right side of the history, so to say, right? And you need to be able to do your work in any circumstances. It's going to be changed work. It's going to be having a different purpose, but it's still, if you want to do it the right way, I think it's very important to ask ourselves if it's worth being an evaluator right now. And third and fourth point would be probably the ethical integrity, because someone in the chat also asked, like, oh, but our donors, our sponsors don't pay for the provocative or thought-provocative evaluations, or they wouldn't pay for the footprint evaluation. Yes, it's very difficult decision. And very often the answer would be, you evaluators from the global north don't understand that there are simply not a situation where I can say no to some evaluation job. And I respect that. And obviously I won't understand every person's life situation, but I can only say that in my own country, how Taco was saying, that I worked with majority of the all companies in Poland. And we were very much on the rise of the EU policy evaluation. And I decided at some point that this is very strongly linked to the growth paradigm evaluation. And what I do to the world as I understand it, and I want to leave to my kids, I do harm. So I decided that I prefer to completely change my profession if this is how it needs to be practiced in my country, and do something else. And I came back to evaluation only because I realized there are also people elsewhere that do different type of evaluation, but I stopped doing evaluation in Poland exactly because I think it very often does harm. And one more point is common workable vision, and that's what Dugan works for. I know that Juha works for without tiredness, and Mina is just so much of a supportive in so many different networks, that we need to understand how we build up a strong, ambitious agenda that is really transforming our thinking, and not just, you know, using a nice jargon and using an elegant words and including some of the trendy words, because I think we evaluators are perfect in using a new language and adapting to new circumstances, rather than really making the effort and colonizing our mind. And by that, I mean, we absolutely need to immerse in a different culture, in a different thinking. And that's only what's the paradigm shift can think, that it's really, really transformational. So if I think about footprint evaluation, and I try to more symbolically think about the footprint, it really gives me the hope that the footprint on the sand, for example, what does it mean culturally for us, is very much about being barefoot, about being vulnerable in connection with the world around us, about showing the present of ourselves in the stillness of moment, that we are here, we are standing, we have ready to act, we are ready to connect, that it's, you know, the barefoot is a very strong symbol. And I love that this wonderful team of evaluators have used this as a symbol of understanding the world around them, of standing on that nexus. And from the culture that I come from where Judaism and Christianity are very important, and I know that in different spiritual worlds and religions, it will have a different meaning, but it's very much that moment when you need to take off your sandals and understand that you are dealing with some sacred world that it's not under your control. And that's how I would like to understand that evaluators can find that humility in themselves, to understand that they are not in control. They're only part of the bigger world that we can connect to and try to leave a positive footprint.
Thank you, Weronika, for that. And thanks to the other panelists also for sharing their experiences and thoughts in such a short period of time. And I guess obviously in the chats there are some comments and questions. I would encourage people to post their questions. If you would want to verbalize, you can just raise up your hand and then I will be given the platform. But in the meantime, let's just go to Candy's question, which is very long. I think Weronika had said you are going to answer this one. Could you just probably answer the question?
Candice, please comment on chat whether I understand it correctly. But I understand in short, the question is about why should we value nature more over the people who are still marginalized and in suffering, and why we cannot use the natural resources to improve their lives. That's basically the argument that I think is there in the quote. And I very much agree that we must do it. And I think there is a priority in providing people safety and not marginalizing any of the group. But the work that the Global North need to do is not to just on a shallow level create some pop philosophy of hipster vegans that will respect the nature. But we really need to deeply understand, learn the global connections and teach to our kids that nature for us means the protection in the Global North and some more of a respect, while we also allow the Global South to use the resources they had and they have still now for their own means. But I hope that answers somehow your question. It's always going to be contextualized. And I don't think there is one simple answer, but I do think the safety of people is supposed to be more important. But the priorities that how Global North understand nature of the people is often in a very ill sense. And when it's people over nature, it's very colonized and abusive sense.
Thank you. Thank you, Weronika, for that. I saw a question again to you from Janine. Janine, do you want to verbalize that question in 30 seconds? Kalita, would you please give Janine the mic?
There we go. Thanks very much, Taku. Yeah, I think I was very interested in hearing on Weronika's views around what that reconstruction might look like. And I think a lot of the debate is around investing. When you invest in one thing, is it at the cost of the other? Although I know Ian was saying that it's not an either or, but I feel like, you know, when we talk about the issue of justice, like the Global South just always seems to be on the back end. And something Zendo said in the first day was, look, there's no developing, there's no developed. We need to understand that the North has failed. And we're all struggling here, trying to find what's the best way forward. And I think there is a level of taking ownership of this and deciding, okay, this is the world that we're living and things are deteriorating and we need to find ways and move forward. So The question around what takes priority over others, and the biosphere is so vast. What do we pick? What do we prioritize? And on the question of urgency, obviously somebody who doesn't see birds anymore, that's urgent for them, while somebody else in Sudan is not eating, for example. So how do we get that kind of balance is what I'm talking about. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janine. Weronika?
Okay, I just wanted to give space to others, but maybe very, very quickly. I will share one slide, and just without much comment, I can also put it into the to the chat later. I think I very much agree with Jason Hicko, and there are many more of economists who are, I think, more at the forefront of understanding how we need to balance better the system that is very much dominated by economical thinking. But it requires much more of the in-depth analysis from the global north. So the global north happy story of wind and solar energy, or green growth, or circular economy, is just not there in evidence-based thinking about how we need to reconstruct. And I think that it just needs, in short, a steady decline of global north, and that's unomitable. How much stories and paradigms we're going to build in global north to try to run away from it is I think, part of our ill thinking and hopes that we don't have to lose our privileges. But I very much think that we must. Thank you.
Thank you. There is another question from Fezela. How can evaluators call out and be just when in most cases evaluators are funded by donors or program funders? How can evaluators be more independent of this so they can call out and be just with confidence? Any takers for this? Dugan, Mine?
Juha has his hand up. Oh my gosh.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Well, yeah, so I mean, I understand that concern very, very well, and I often hear it from many evaluators who, especially who work as consultants and so on, and are dependent on contracts from commissioners and so on. Which per se is a challenge for the profession, because that the fact that it is so much driven by the consultancy market. So we should try to move away from that, and that is obviously one factor that is leading to that compartmentalization that Mine was talking about, that your job is to look at this protected area, or your job is to look at the this piece of industry and forget about the rest. So it's not an easy question, but there are some institutional ways of doing it, and with the risk of waving my own flag, is that some of these independent internal evaluation units, like the ones that we have in the GEF, but we have them in virtually all international multilateral development banks. We have them in increasingly in the UN. And some foundations are having it. These foundations are doing very interesting work, but you never hear about them because the reports are basically internal usually. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that we have if you're an independent internal unit that reports to the governing body, for example, of the organization, then you are in a much better position, A, to ask whatever questions you are interested in. You have your independent budget and so on, and you manage it and your work program. And B, you can also do things such as longer term evaluations and ex-post evaluations. You can go and look at a set of projects 10 years after they were initiated or whatever. So that's a step in the right direction. You are still bound pretty much to your own organization. Then there's a step further, which would be the fact that you might have some truly independent evaluator-driven initiatives, such as the new Independent Evaluation Academy, in which some of us are involved, or the 3IE, the Independent Institute for Impact Evaluation, or whatever 3IE stands for, which sets its own agenda. It still goes on to, we all try to get some funding for the activities, and that's not easy, obviously, but that would be the ideal thing, that you would have evaluative thinking beyond this consultancy business. And again, drawing on all knowledge from other sources as well. So there's a lot of evaluative activities that are being done beyond the evaluation profession, for example, especially if I'm thinking about this environmental work. So there's a lot of organizations and people who look at the effectiveness of some protection or, nature conservation activity. They don't call it evaluation, but we can learn from those kind of things also and bring that knowledge into, which doesn't then have to cost us a lot of money. Thanks.
Thank you, Juha. There's a question from Rodney here, which I would want to know more from our experts on examples of decolonizing culturally responsive and anti-racist practices and principles of this footprint stance and the implications on massive environmental and contextual inequalities. Dugan, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I do. Thank you so much. And just to note that I'm finding the chat box fantastic, as always. It's really a kind of a real benefit of our shift to virtual, is the chat box often really means that we'll end up having 2 engagements rather than just the one. When we think about how long we've been having this conversation, it's a relatively recent innovation. It's maybe just over a decade. And like you, Rodney, I spent a lot of time thinking about, I want to see examples of what you've called decolonizing culturally responsive and anti-racist practices. And it's been hard to unearth those. And I came to the realization, and it was echoed yesterday in the conversation that I sat in on decolonizing evaluation, that getting those examples on the table is the work. That's the job. That's what we need to be doing. It's our role as people with influence and who are privileged in this space to be developing those alternatives. And that really is what we have to be doing. That's the challenge to each of us. And the Global Evaluation Initiative, which is the program I'm honored to manage, but which is far more than the work we do, is an example of one of the kinds of things that's going on in relation to evaluation seeking to transform itself. So, when we start developing a sensibility or a consciousness as a system, as a global system, and start naming what it is that we understand to be the problems we have to overcome, and where we start developing a vision for what it would look like if we were different, I think we're starting to lay out our agenda. And the NEC conference Turin agenda, I think, does start to give some shape to that. And it is starting to talk about evaluation being done differently and being differently used so that it supports a different dynamic in relation to power and in relation to how people's lives are experienced. And for me personally, I think the growing realization is that evaluation is not successful when there's better evidence, but evaluation is better, or evaluation is successful when ordinary people lead better lives because there were better decisions. And I think to be extending our understanding of what the evaluation results chain looks like is quite a big deal. Do you know what I mean? Like, we're not just here to produce better evidence. We are actually meant to be seeing the river not get poisoned. That's really what we are trying to do here. And that more expansive scope is important. And as we go, our stories about evaluation need to get better. So Njiba yesterday was talking about a practice in Ghana of the community coming together and having an opportunity to speak truth to power in a way that you usually can't, and be critical without fear of retribution. Now, to me, that's not evaluation, but it could be part of an evaluative process. And I think this business of finding examples that are grounded in the African experience, that are deeply rooted in traditions and practices and can be understood to be elements of a reimagined evaluative practice, are the work we need to be doing, like unearthing those examples, giving them space and shape and spotlighting them, giving them airtime and sunlight. That's the business we need to be in. Because if we continue to do what we've always done, we're colluding in this model, which is killing our planet. Back to you, Taku.
Thanks, Dugan. There is another, I see the chat is firing up there. There's a question by Wanjuru. Wanjuru, do you want to verbalize that question in 30 seconds? JB, can you give Wanjuru a mic? Okay, it's there. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yes, this is I'm Wanjiro Nderito from Kenya. And I'm just, I appreciate all the presentations. It's wonderful. And my bond, especially when I'm trying to connect environment and people. And I'm just asking, how about anchoring Global South evaluation indicators? I'm not very sure we have them anyway, but we are thinking now on variable branch philosophically, which is very rich in norms and culture that preserved our environment, our forests, for long decades. You know, we believed that everything, nature, is sacred in a way. There's some sacred portion or notion in everything that we believe in a deity, God we believe in. So, and especially when we realize that the world is in belts and most of these climatical belts have been destroyed, and especially now coming from global north, where it affects us here, global south. So how do we, what about anchoring our evaluations on the branch philosophically? I'm just thinking round. I mean, not that I have an answer. I'm posing this to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Wanjiro. Panelists, anyone with an answer for that?
Yeah, I don't have an answer, but I would like to. Wanjiro, I saw your comment and I really liked it, and thank you for raising it. And I was actually reflecting as we were discussing earlier that this seemed to be quite a strong, almost the sense of there's people and nature. And I think we really need to interrogate that because we are nature. I find it quite interesting that somehow along the way, over the of our history, we came to believe we are separate from nature, and therefore we can dominate it and we can shape it and manipulate it to suit ourselves. And I think if we're able to interrogate and really question that deep-seated belief, drawing on indigenous wisdom, because they got it right, actually, and we seem to somehow forget that. And if we can bring that back and incorporate, as you say, you know, maybe incorporate some of that wisdom into our evaluation practice as indicators, perhaps we can make some headway around that. And I think part of that is also, I'm seeing it reflected in, I think it was Weronika who spoke about buzzwords. I'm not sure who it was. But the other day I had an entire conversation around transformation that didn't mention the word environment. And I thought that's fascinating. I've seen entire conversations around sustainability, which have nothing to do with the environment. And I think that's scary. And I think as evaluators, we have enough resources and materials to be able to interrogate those beliefs. There's enough out there that we can draw on, and evidence we can draw on, and globally accepted evidence we can put on the table and say, actually, it's fundamental to words and concepts and notions such as transformation and sustainability. So I didn't answer it, but I sort of used it as to build on that. Thank you, Anjiru.
Thank you very much, Mina. There is also an issue around capitalism here. I don't see where exactly the chat has started, but how then is capitalism contributing to this thinking that is dominant, and how can other worldviews like communism, socialism then help with addressing equity issues from a development perspective, and how can evaluation help with this? Anyone to take on that one?
We would spend here, I think, another half a day at least, another week.
Yeah, just in 30 seconds, Weronika, what would be your response to that?
Oh, I responded on the chat, and I think I will give floor to Dugan.
Okay, sure. Dugan, do you have anything?
You know, when I was a young man and I had great hair and a waistline and I was filled with hope and enthusiasm, I imagined there were alternatives to capitalism. But I think what's happened is the problem is not capitalism, but the form of capitalism we've opted for. That, in fact, we're experiencing an extreme version of radical capitalism, which is so exclusionary and so extractive that we're not even able to understand its dimensions any longer. Like, we act as though there is no other way of being market-based. And in fact, there are many different forms of capitalism that are gentler, both on people and the planet. And I think, as Mina is saying, you can't be gentle on one without being gentle on the other. And we have to kind of really step back and think about a society in which Elon Musk is doing to Twitter what he is, because it's actually really deeply, profoundly, and extremely problematic that we have these grotesque levels of inequality, and people are shameless about it. And many of our colleagues and comrades idolize and venerate the Bill Gateses and the Elon Musks of the world, when in fact, that practice of accumulating such immense wealth is unimaginable and not, in fact, the only way of being capitalist. So I really think that we have to reimagine our economic systems in ways that are realistic. And I mean, you know, I'm obviously part of the problem because I'm a white man. I work at the World Bank, and I have a tradition of always positioning myself in institutions that I thought were powerful and in jobs where I thought I had leverage. And I do want to promote systems change and encourage new ways of thinking about being different. And I think that we can reimagine capitalism without needing to do a Pol Pot cultural sort of, you know, we don't have to do a year zero exercise. I think there are ways of being different that are doable and realistic.
Thank you very much, Dugan. I think in light of time, like Weronika has already said, we can still talk for more and more minutes, hours, and days. I think what I'm taking away from this is that there is a need for that policy coherence around conscientizing our people and the governments in terms of how to integrate issues of climate change in their strategies, in their plans, and so forth. And really there are discussions that have already started happening, like the recently completed COP27 around climate change and climate crisis. But of course, there are issues with other countries that are really benefiting, you know, from this whole pandemic around climate change. And how do we navigate such dynamism and complexity of those countries that continue to want, or that want to continue to perpetuate issues that has to do with climate change? And obviously the issue that Weronika has just brought around atmospheric colonization, that we are bearing the brand of climate change, those in the global south. So it is very important that we start to put actions to ending climate change or mitigating and adapting to climate change. So with that, I think Sia, the panelists have done a good job in terms of the questions that have been posed today. And indeed, evaluation should now find its own way of how it can be embedded in issues that has to do with climate change, and also making sure that it is a functional agent that can bring about evidence that is really needed to make decisions on climate change and the consequences that climate change is bringing about. Who knows, maybe these are the last days of breathing fresh air. So if we do not act, who's gonna act? With that, Sia, I hand over to you.
No, thank you very much to the panelists. Firstly, I think, yeah, those are thought-provoking conversations that we've been having, both on the chat and the audience has been very lively. And I think my key takeaways is that these are complex issues, and that linear thinking will not cut it. And also, we need also to not only show the contradictions, but to confront them as they exist, as we speak about footprint and evaluation and climate change. I'd like to thank everyone who's been part of this discussion, and I'd like to invite everyone to join the closing session, which starts at 2 o'clock in less than 30 minutes from now. In about 30 minutes from now, we'll be just speaking to the Made in Africa evaluation paradigm and some efforts that have been done towards actualizing the Made in Africa evaluation paradigm. This is our closing sessions for the INDABA, and I look forward to seeing everyone in the last session. And thank you very much for these thought-provoking conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the privilege of being with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me
Thanks.
to it. It's great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.